We here at the Sports History Network proudly partner with 26 podcasts, all revolving around the history of sports. But did you know that many of our hosts were sports history authors way before they started their shows? It's true. We've got Joe Ziemba, host of When Football Was Football, Joe Zagurski, host of Pro Football in the 1970s, Mark Morthier, host of Yesterday Sports, Tommy Phillips, host of Lombardi Memories, and Scott Adamson, co-host of From the 55-Yard Line. All these authors have many books for you to choose from. To check them out, go to our website at sportshistorynetwork.com/sportshistorybooks. Pick up your copy today. Soundtrack provided by Kevin MacLeod of filmmusic.io.
This podcast is part of the Sports History Network, your headquarters for the yesteryear of your favorite sport. You can learn more at sportshistorynetwork.com.
Hello and welcome to the Sports History Network Showcase, our in-house show featuring SHN podcasters talking sports, talking history, and talking sports history. My name is Oz Davis, host of the Sports History Network's Truly the Goats podcast. And on this episode of the Showcase, I'll be joined by John Davis, host of the Sports History Network podcast For the Good of the Game. John, how are you doing today?
Doing wonderful.
Great. Let's just get right into it. I want to talk your podcast with you, but first let's talk about your background. Now, you've been a coach, is that correct?
It's correct. I actually started out, I was a career military officer, and during the period of time I was on active duty, during that span of time, we had 4 children, 3 boys and a girl. And because I had played up through my sophomore year of college, I was very interested in coaching the kids. So I ended up coaching from basically the flag football level, starting at about 8 years old, up through high school football for 20 plus years, spanning all of my kids growing up. So I was very blessed to coach all 4 of my kids in every sport they played when I wasn't deployed with the Army. So it was a great experience. A lot of training, a lot of heartache, but a whole lot of satisfaction and, really having a lot of impact, hopefully on, a few kids' lives.
Great. What sports do your daughters play?
Well, my daughter played flag football. 3 boys and a girl. The daughter's the youngest. So she grew up. We used to say that, with 3 older brothers, she was harder than woodpecker lips. So she actually started out playing flag football in a league where she was the only girl, and she used to put her hair up in a bun, and it used to frustrate her because through the first series of games, the other coaches would yell, "Catch him." She was the fastest kid in the league of all, faster than all the boys. And she was indignant that they said, catch him, until they discovered she was a girl, which of course, made it even worse for the players on the other team because they got beat by a girl. So, but I coached baseball and football primarily, all ages, as I said, up through high school. I helped with indoor soccer at one point, and I've done some individual sports. And then I also ran an indoor track club with a guy who's a good friend of mine who was the Senior Olympics gold medalist in the 100 and 200 meters. And we had an indoor track club, but it was primarily football and baseball.
Okay. Now, the podcast itself seems to be an offshoot of the website. And I'd like to talk about the podcast in just a moment. But how long were you doing the website? And was this your first foray into actual formal football history?
No, the history piece was really a pretty natural play for me because of how I got into podcasting. So first of all, I was literally driving Uber one day, and which I do periodically just because I enjoy the heck out of it. It's a lot of fun. And I was talking to David Diaz-Infante, who played for the Denver Broncos, won 2 Super Bowl rings with them. And at one time, when David made his first start in the NFL, he was the oldest player to have started his first time at that age. Mm. And I said, we were going to call the podcast Old Dogs and New Tricks because I was going to be interviewing a lot of older guys. And I said, yeah, the byline's going to be For the Good of the Game. And he said, he goes, you ought to make that the title of the podcast. Mm. So I ended up eventually deciding to do that. The history piece really came in more because I had several jobs where I was very blessed to hire and work with multiple former NFL alumni to do football camps for the company and I worked for. And then I also worked I was the director of tryout camps for two different pro leagues that unfortunately never got off the ground.
Which leagues?
Well, one was Major League Football, which is originally tried to start up as a spring league about 5 years ago. It failed and tried again. And to be honest, it's not off the back burner yet. There are still possibilities. And then there was another league that ultimately I'm not affiliated with it anymore. It dribbled into the spring league, which you hear so much about. But the idea was, I was sitting around talking to my wife about this, and she said, well, you've got all these guys in your contact list. Why don't you just, you've got all these associations, all these friendships and all these colleagues from past jobs. Why don't you give a few guys a call and see if they'd be interested? So I spent about a week doing that. And by the time it was over with, I had 43 guys who had agreed to do podcast interviews. And, very blessed to have guys like Ted Cottrell, the innovator of the 4-3 defense, Billy White Shoes Johnson, who I consider still to this day probably the greatest return man and probably the guy who should be credited with the end zone celebration, a la the Funky Chicken.
Sure.
So
I believe he's still on the all-time team.
Yeah. In fact, it was really kind of neat because we had to redo his interview. We did it in Atlanta and at a hotel, and he wasn't feeling good. So I came back about 2 months later and we re-interviewed him in an actual studio, and the interview itself came out wonderful. And nice. We were able to incorporate some of his highlights into the video and stuff like that. So it was kind of cool. But yeah, so the history part was really more linked to the fact that when you looked at last year as the 100th year of the NFL and how all the celebrations that went on, it was really more of kind of a tribute to say, wow, a lot of these guys played. And it was neat, for instance, to see Billy at the Super Bowl. They introduced, the 75th anniversary team, I think, or 100th anniversary all-time team. And he was out there with several of the other guys that I had interviewed. So that was really neat. And so it was really more of an era type of thing when these guys played that kind of brought the history into it.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of For the Good of the Game. My name is John Davis, JD, and I'm
your podcast has an interesting format in that you almost have these story arcs from season to season, like these themes, like in the way of modern TV shows, basically, in the way of modern podcast series as well. Tell us a little bit about that. How do you arrange these seasons thematically?
Well, when we started out last year with season 1, the idea was the name of the podcast needed to generate a little bit of interest, even if I figured it would be a slow growth, organic growth, because it's a niche podcast, like so many of us are. So, when I wanted to get at For the Good of the Game as the title, I thought, well, here's what we're going to do. We're going to go after these interviews as being football insights and life skills. I want young kids as well as older adults who might, the young kids aren't necessarily going to know who all these guys are, but their parents will. So as we go through this, I wanted there to be goodness in the interviews that we did. So we focused on things like, well, at what age did you start playing? How did you get into football? What did you learn? What coaches were instrumental in impacting your career, either in high school or college? And little nuggets you learn. Like, for instance, Ted Cottrell, didn't start playing football until he was in high school. And he ended up actually winning more national championships and accolades as a track and field guy as he did prior to being inducted into his college football Hall of Fame. And then ultimately, got drafted and played a year in the league and another year or two in the CFL before he retired and became a coach. So it was going after the football insights and life skills because I wanted there to be a takeaway or a lesson learned or wisdom from each episode that a young kid, an athlete, be they in middle school or high school, can relate to and say, wow, here's a guy that made it to the highest level or coached at the highest level. And here's what he was saying. Maybe I can learn something from that. And then for season 2, I really didn't want to get into X's and O's. There's a million podcasts that do, football tactics, if you will. So I really focused on relationships, and it was reaching back out to a few of the guys I had talked to and being very fortunate to have, we ended up having Anthony Munoz on the first episode, Bruce Smith on the third episode. And what we did was we focused on their relationship with the coach that was with them. In the case of Anthony Munoz, Jim McNally, who they were together for 13 years at the Cincinnati Bengals. So it was more thematically, it was more like, okay, I want to go from the insights and life skills to more of a relationship piece and say, what can we glean from the relationships that contributed to those, either the coaches or the players' success or both, and how their relationship with each other, as well as the rest of the team in the culture that was set up, in which they related and interacted, helped them progress through their careers. And even doing, we did Bill Curry, his video called The Huddle, which he did shortly after, or he got the idea for shortly after 9/11, was really the genesis for the whole relationships piece, because he talks about in The Huddle it being, kind of a cauldron for building those relationships. Doesn't matter what your skin color, your religion, your background, where you're from, your economic status, that 11 guys in the huddle of a football team are there as brothers to give way together and try and achieve a common goal. And that's kind of the way we wanted to do this season. So the interview with Coach Curry was pretty impactful. June Jones, even though it was a single interview, we still did the relationships piece, talking with all the stuff that he had done. So it's, I'm actually, even though I'm only a third of the way through season 2, we're actually looking now at building the theme for season 3 so we can start lining up interviews well ahead of time, because I'm really excited about, trying to grow this thing as we move along.
Right. We're talking with John Davis, host of the Sports History Network podcast, For the Good of the Game. You want to give us a teaser for a couple of upcoming episodes?
Well, we just released one called Host the Hosts, where I interviewed 3 high school coaches who are all also podcast hosts. And they are all 3 authors. They all 3 write, and one of them runs camps. I have the episode we're going to release this week is with a gentleman who is an NFL agent, and he represents both players and coaches. And then we've got an interview coming up where we're trying to present perspectives from opposite sides of the pond. I'm interviewing 2 guys that are huge into parent engagement and coach training, one of whom is from Chattanooga, Tennessee, and the other is from the UK and lives outside of London. So we're going to get 2 completely different cultural perspectives on, parents in sports, as it were, and the relationships and how their businesses interact and help, hopefully build strong bonds for kids as they grow up through sports.
Who's your dream guest? Who's one or maybe a couple players or coaches or figures or whoever that you would like to have on?
On the coaching side, it would be probably Tony Dungy and Herm Edwards. I have a tremendous amount of respect for both those guys. I certainly have other guys that I would enjoy interviewing, but I think with what those 2 guys have done and their approach to coaching, I really have tremendous admiration for. From a player standpoint, one old and one new, or one current. I think I'd really like to interview Earl Campbell, and I have reached out to him several times. I've not been successful in touching base with him. Of course, he has a foundation, and he's got gatekeepers that do his do his interaction. So I have not. Although he just had his birthday, maybe I ought to try again by singing happy birthday to him on a video or something. But there, and the other one is Larry Fitzgerald. I would really, and I do actually have some inroads. One of his former offseason coaches is a good friend of mine, and we have chatted. Although I'm leaving him alone right now because he's a high school coach in California, and they're in season right now. So, but I would love to have on the player side, be Earl Campbell and probably Larry Fitzgerald. And there's some others, but those are the ones that pop into my mind as definitely being on my dream list.
Okay, so we're going to get you out of here real soon, but just wanted to get your impression. What do you make of what's been happening this offseason in the NFL? The early bets on the Super Bowl or the draft?
Well, I tell you, it's interesting. I'm a lifetime Alabama fan. And if just following the fact that Alabama just had their second pro day today, and the guys that they've got coming out, I mean, they're potentially draft wide, all layers of the draft. They may end up with definitely double digit draftees, but I honestly believe, based on the move that was just made by the 49ers and the fact that Shanahan's offense is very quarterback friendly and Mac Jones is more of a true pocket passer, it is not going to surprise me at all. And there's no genius on my part. I mean, I just literally before we got on was watching SportsCenter as I was eating a snack and they were talking about this. I really believe we may see Mac Jones go third to the San Francisco 49ers, who traded up to get that spot. I think that the season expanding to 17 games, even though in the net they shortened it by one preseason game, so you're still going to have 20 games total, 3 preseason, 17 in season. I think that's it's a money grab by the NFL and the owners, in my opinion, but it does so without increasing necessarily the quantity of risk for the individual players, because they're still playing the same amount of games. One of them will now be more meaningful than it was before. So it'll be interesting to see how that affects the situation. And then again, with COVID, we don't know. I'm sure I would be willing to bet that by the time the season kicks off, they'll probably require all the players to have been vaccinated at that point.
Oh, yeah.
Because that's going to, decrease the overall risk. Yeah. And I'm sure they'll still have protocols and everything, but it's going to be interesting to me to see, how things play out. I absolutely, in my opinion, given the fact that the Tampa Bay Buccaneers were able to re-sign every single one of their 22 starters on offense and defense after the Super Bowl, I certainly give the early nod to Tampa Bay as being a heavy preseason favorite to go to repeat. But I don't think you can count out Kansas City. I just don't know what their status is going to be. It's going to be interesting to see what they do with the draft and how they bolster their line.
The Rams have a real quarterback now. Can I interest you in the Rams?
True. There are several teams that have made early moves, and then, who knows what's going to happen with the Jags, and they seem intent, based on what Urban Meyer has said, to take Trevor Lawrence. We'll have to wait and see. I'm always leery of, especially quarterbacks. Other positions are not necessarily, other than maybe left tackle and running back, other positions are a little bit easier. And I'm saying this having never played in the NFL, so take it for what it's worth. They seem to me, based on as a fan and as a former coach, at least at the lower levels, it's easier to step into some of those positions and learn an offense and be able to perform at a high level. But quarterbacks are unique in that, like so many other sports, there's such a cerebral part to it. It really is about the football IQ of the guy and the system he goes to. And I'll tell you, from having had discussions with multiple friends of mine who are former NFL players, so much depends upon the system the player goes to, because a great player can go to a system that is not suited for his skill set, and regardless of how well he does, how good the coaching is, and all that, it just may never be a good match. And I'm not talking about like the Ryan Leafs of the world, but that you may see that evidence of that may be Sam Darnold with the Jets, and there's a few other guys. We'll have to wait and see. So I'm always a little leery about quarterbacks, left tackles, and running backs in terms of just jumping right in and becoming a starter, because of the criticality of those positions. Running backs more so in blitz pickup and blocking than even running the ball. And obviously quarterback and left tackle are connected, or right tackle in the case of if you're Tua Tagovailoa, because you got to have your right tackle cover your blind side. But it's those kind of things are always a little iffy to me. So I don't know. We'll have to see, how the Rams fare, given the fact that they picked up a good quarterback now.
Yeah, well, we like it, Los Angeles here. One last question. You said you're a Crimson Tide fan. Will you admit to being any fan of an NFL team? Titans, Cowboys?
I have been. It's so funny you ask, because I have often been criticized for my eclectic taste in teams. I have been a lifelong Cowboys fan, to the extent that back in the day, my dad he had an insurance company, and the company had an RV that they owned, and he would loan it out to clients. And not every Thanksgiving, but many Thanksgivings, my mom would make Thanksgiving dinner a day ahead of time. We'd load everybody in the RV and we'd go tailgate and then go into the game.
Nice.
And that was even, back when the old stadium, the old indoor stadium had just been built. I went to one game at the Cotton Bowl, but it was most of the time it was after that. But I've been a lifelong Boston Red Sox fan of baseball, Cowboys fan in football, Alabama fan in college baseball, and my oldest son and I are both Syracuse graduates, so we follow Syracuse basketball collegiately. And I follow their football team. Unfortunately, they just haven't had a real strong run recently since Donovan McNabb. But it is what it is. But yeah, Cowboys are my NFL team.
My alma mater is University of New Mexico. I don't need to hear it about bad football teams. All right, John Davis, host of the Sports History Network podcast For the Good of the Game. Thanks for joining us today.
My pleasure. It's been an honor.
Yeah, thanks very much. Keep up the great work, man. You got a great. Seriously, everybody out there. I don't usually do this, but everybody out there, you got to check out this podcast. Some fantastic interviews like we just talked about. Several players on the all-time NFL team. You got to check out this podcast. Great work, John. Thanks.
Thanks, I appreciate it.
This has been the Sports History Network Showcase podcast. We'd like to thank our guest, John Davis, of the For the Good of the Game podcast, which is available through sportshistorynetwork.com or wherever you get your podcasts. The theme song for the SHN Showcase is Quartz by Anitech, and it is available through fair use agreement via freemusicarchive.org. SHN Showcase will be back soon with another Sports History Network podcast. Until then, this is Oz Davis saying stay safe and stay historical.
At the Sports History Network, we're all about sports yesteryear, and so we're so pleased to introduce you to Row One, an online memorabilia gallery and shop that brings your sports history to life anywhere. The Row One gallery includes over 5,200 gorgeously reproduced prints of team posters, game program covers, game tickets, advertisements, and more in baseball, pro and college football, pro and college basketball, and more. And any gallery item may be printed in a variety of sizes on wood, metal, canvas, acrylic, or poster paper. And in Row One shop, check out the thousands more of unique items with the retro and historical designs dating back to 1876, including t-shirts, long sleeve shirts, phone cases, mugs, blankets, pillows, towels, and even shower curtains. Go to sportshistorynetwork.com, ROW1, for access to the full Row One catalog and for gallery prints and gift items, plus get a 15% discount off all prints on the Row One Pictorum Gallery with coupon code SHN15. Follow the link on the show notes.